Susan had always believed in the stability of her family. Her marriage to Mark had been filled with years of routines, shared dinners, weekends with their children, and holidays with their grandchildren. She had never suspected that anything was amiss. That is, until the fateful Saturday afternoon of their youngest granddaughter, Emma's, 6th birthday party. The sun was just starting to dip behind the trees as guests filled their plates with cake, children shrieking with joy, and the hum of chatter filling the air. Susan stood by the backyard grill, preparing to serve the next round of hot dogs when she saw him, Mark, standing near the edge of the garden, deep in conversation with a woman she had never seen before. Her heart skipped. He was laughing, leaning in closer than she had ever seen him with another woman in public. His hand lightly grazed the woman's arm, a touch too familiar for Susan's taste. She squinted, trying to make out more of the woman's face, but something was strangely familiar about her. As she moved closer, a jolt of realization hit her. The woman's features slowly came into focus, and the name rose to the surface of her memory. Carol, Mark's old classmate from college. She hadn't seen her in years, but Susan remembered how they had both attended Mark's 50th birthday celebration just a few years ago, though she had never spent much time with her. Susan's chest tightened. Something wasn't right. The way Mark looked at Carol, the way they smiled at each other, there was an intimacy, a connection Susan hadn't seen in years. It was like they were in their own world, completely unaware of the party happening around them. She couldn't shake the nagging feeling that something had been going on for much longer than this birthday celebration. Her suspicions, once buried, now surged to the surface like a tidal wave. She excused herself from the grill, slipping into the house without anyone noticing, and grabbed her phone. The history of late-night calls and text messages between Mark and Carol suddenly made sense. How had she been so blind? As she dialed the number, the ringing felt deafening in her ears. He answered on the second ring. Susan. Everything okay? Mark's voice had an almost nervous edge to it. I think we need to talk, Susan said, her voice steady but cold. She hung up without waiting for a response. In those few seconds, the quiet rage building inside her consumed her. She returned to the party, trying to act natural, but her mind was racing. She had to confront him. It would be now or never. She made her way toward Mark and Carol. The music from the party blurred into the background, the children's laughter drowned out by the pounding in her chest. Mark caught sight of her approaching, his face flickering with a hint of concern, though he quickly masked it with a forced smile. Susan, he greeted her, as if nothing had changed. She stopped a few feet away from them, glaring at Mark first, then slowly turning her gaze to Carol. The woman's confident smile faltered, as if she could sense the storm brewing. Are you going to tell me, Mark, or do I have to figure it out myself? Susan's words were clipped, each one landing like a heavy blow. Mark's face drained of color, his mouth opening and closing in silence. He tried to speak, but the words stuck in his throat. Carol shifted uncomfortably but didn't speak. Susan could feel her heart pounding in her throat. It felt like time slowed as she waited for Mark's inevitable confession. Susan, Mark finally stammered, his voice shaky. He couldn't meet her eyes. I know, Susan said, her voice icy. I've known for a while now. The late-night texts. The way you look at her. This has been going on for longer than just today, hasn't it? Mark swallowed, his expression breaking. He opened his mouth to respond, but nothing came out. It was as if all the lies he had spun over the years had finally caught up to him. The air between them felt thick with tension, and for a long moment, neither of them spoke. Susan's gaze never wavered from Mark's face, her anger simmering just below the surface. You've ruined everything, Mark, she finally whispered, her voice trembling now, but not with fear, anger, grief, betrayal. This isn't just about you and her. This is about the years I've wasted, trusting you. Believing in you. You've shattered it all. Carol, realizing the depth of the confrontation, quietly backed away, muttering a weak apology before disappearing into the crowd of partygoers. But Susan didn't notice. Her focus was solely on Mark. As he stood there, visibly broken, Susan felt a strange calm wash over her. She had known, deep down, that this day would come. But now that it had, she realized there was no going back. "Fix this," she said, her voice low. "Fix yourself. Or I'm done." And with that, she turned on her heel and walked away, leaving Mark standing alone at their granddaughter's birthday party, with only the echoes of his mistakes in the air around him. The days that followed felt like a blur. Susan couldn't remember the last time she had felt so numb. She had stayed in the house for most of the week, watching the rain come down in sheets, but all she could hear was the silence between her and Mark. The conversations had stopped, the daily routine dismantled. They had barely spoken since the party, and when they did, it was brief, awkward, and full of tension. Mark had tried, at first, to explain, but Susan couldn't bring herself to listen to the excuses. She had seen enough, felt enough. She knew what betrayal looked like, and it was staring her in the face every time she saw him. He had been more careful about hiding it, but the damage was done. It wasn't the affair that hurt the most, it was the way he had so easily shattered the trust they had spent decades building. By Thursday evening, Mark's attempts to apologize had become more desperate. He stood in the doorway of their bedroom, his hands trembling, voice pleading, "Susan, please. I made a mistake. A terrible mistake. I need you. I want us to fix this, together." Susan was sitting on the edge of the bed, her eyes fixed on the window as the rain continued to pour outside. She didn't turn to face him. "Do you really think you can fix this?" she asked quietly, her voice tinged with disbelief. Mark's face fell. He stepped into the room and sat beside her, his hand reaching out, but Susan pulled back. "I don't know if I can forgive you," she said, finally turning to look at him. Her eyes were no longer filled with anger, but with a quiet sadness that Mark hadn't seen before. It was worse, somehow. Mark swallowed, his voice cracking. "What do you want me to do?" "I'll do anything, Susan." Susan sighed, shaking her head. "I don't know if there's anything left to do, Mark. You crossed a line. You broke something in me that I don't think you can fix." Mark seemed to shrink, his shoulders slumping as if the weight of his actions was too much for him to bear. For a moment, there was silence, broken only by the faint sound of the storm outside. "I never meant for this to happen," he whispered. Susan chuckled bitterly. "You never meant for it to happen, but it did. And now I'm left with the pieces." The words hung in the air, heavy and undeniable. Susan stood up, her body trembling as she crossed the room. She didn't want to be near him anymore. Every part of her wanted to flee, to escape the suffocating weight of what had become of their lives. "I need space," she said, her voice barely audible. Mark opened his mouth to say something, but no words came out. He watched her leave the room, her silhouette disappearing down the hallway, and then the sound of the front door opening and closing. Susan didn't know where she was going, only that she couldn't stay in that house, in that life, for one more minute. She drove through the night, her mind spinning with thoughts of the past, of what could have been, and of what she was going to do next. She ended up at her sister's house, a small cottage tucked away on the outskirts of town. She had driven there without thinking, the familiarity of the place offering a small comfort. Her sister, Karen, was surprised to see her at this hour, but didn't ask questions. She let Susan in and made her tea, sitting quietly beside her as the rain tapped on the windows. "Do you want to talk about it?" Karen asked after a long silence. Susan stared into the mug, her hands trembling. "I don't know where to start. I don't know if I can forgive him. I don't know if I can stay." Karen placed a hand on Susan's shoulder, her voice soft. "You don't have to make any decisions right now. Take your time. But remember, you're not alone. We'll figure this out, one step at a time. Susan nodded, though she wasn't sure how much comfort she found in her sister's words. The reality of the situation was settling in. She had a long road ahead of her. One that would require more strength than she knew she had. The next few days felt like a blur of emotion. Susan stayed with Karen, finding small moments of peace in the quiet of her sister's home. But as much as she tried to escape the reality of what had happened, it was always there, lurking in the back of her mind. Mark called every day, each message filled with desperation. But Susan couldn't bring herself to pick up the phone. It wasn't just the affair that broke her, it was the realization that she had been blind to his lies for so long. She had trusted him completely, and now, she wasn't sure what to trust anymore. And then, one evening, as she sat with Karen in front of the fire, she made a decision. She would have to confront Mark, face to face, to find out if there was any chance of repairing what had been broken. But deep down, she knew that even if they did try to repair it, things would never be the same. She would never look at him the same way again. The next day, she returned home. Mark was there, sitting on the couch, his face gaunt, eyes red from lack of sleep. When he saw her, he stood up, as if waiting for permission to speak. "I'm sorry," he whispered. Susan nodded, not sure how to respond. She had to confront him now. There was no more running. "Mark, I need to know if this was just a mistake, or if this is who you've become. Because I don't think I can live with the person you are right now." Mark hesitated. He opened his mouth to speak, but his words faltered. For the first time in their marriage, he didn't have an answer. The silence between them stretched, unbearable and thick. Mark stood there, unsure of how to approach her, unsure if he even deserved to speak after everything that had happened. His heart hammered in his chest, each beat a reminder of the devastation he had caused. But no words came, just an overwhelming sense of guilt that he couldn't escape. Susan stood in the doorway, her arms crossed tightly, the weight of the decision pressing down on her. Every part of her wanted to leave, to walk out that door and never look back. But she stayed, because there was a part of her, some small, still hopeful part, that needed closure. She needed to know if this could ever be fixed, or if she was simply clinging to a version of Mark that no longer existed. "I can't just pretend everything is fine, Mark," she said, her voice steady but tinged with pain. "You betrayed me in ways that I can't ignore. It's not just the affair, it's the lies. The way you made me doubt myself. Do you even realize what that does to a person?" Mark's eyes filled with tears, his hands shaking. "I know. I know I hurt you, Susan. And I can't take it back. I wish I could. I can't explain why I did it. It's like I got lost, and I didn't even realize it. But I swear, I never wanted to hurt you." "You didn't have to," Susan replied, her voice trembling with a mix of anger and sadness. "You just had to be honest with me. You just had to be a decent human being." Mark's face contorted in anguish, his chest rising and falling in ragged breaths. "I'm sorry. I am so sorry. I can't undo it, but I want to try to fix it. I don't want to lose you, Susan. I can't imagine my life without you." Susan let the words hang in the air between them. It was everything she had wanted to hear, but it didn't make the pain go away. It didn't erase the years of trust that had been torn apart in a matter of months. She could see the sincerity in Mark's eyes, but sincerity alone couldn't repair the wreckage. "You can't fix this with words, Mark," she said softly, her eyes not meeting his. "You've already taken so much from me. And I don't know if I can ever get it back." A long, painful silence followed. Mark stood frozen, like a man who had just realized he was watching the destruction of something irreplaceable. He opened his mouth to speak again, but the words didn't come. What could he say that hadn't already been said? What could he do to convince her to stay, to believe in him again? Susan took a slow, steady breath. She couldn't keep living in the limbo between what had been and what could never be again. "I need time, Mark," she said, finally looking him in the eyes. "I need to figure out if I can live with this. If I can forgive you. But don't think that just because you're sorry means everything will be fine." Mark nodded, tears streaming down his face. "I'll give you the time you need. I'll do whatever it takes, Susan. I love you. I swear I do." Susan swallowed hard, feeling the weight of the decision press against her chest. She had spent years building her life with Mark, but the foundation had been cracked, and she wasn't sure it could ever be repaired. "I can't promise anything," she said quietly, her voice breaking. "But I'll try to find out if there's anything left for us. I don't know, Mark. I need to figure out who I am without you first. I can't keep living like this." Mark nodded, his face a mask of helplessness and regret. He wanted to reach out, to hold her, but he knew that it wasn't his place anymore, not until she decided what she needed. All he could do now was wait. Susan walked past him and into the living room, the familiar space now feeling strange, foreign. She sat down on the couch, her hands trembling as she rested them on her lap. Mark remained standing by the door, watching her, as if waiting for something to change, for some miracle to fix what he had broken. But Susan knew that there were no miracles. There was only time, and the slow, painful process of rebuilding, or maybe, in her case, walking away. The days that followed were filled with a haunting quiet. Mark left the house most days, unsure of how to handle the tension that now hung between them. He called, texted, and even left small notes around the house, apologizing and begging for a chance to prove himself. But each message felt like a reminder of the distance that had grown between them, a constant ache she couldn't ignore. Susan, on the other hand, found herself torn between wanting to believe in the man she had once loved and the crushing realization that he wasn't the person she thought he was. There were moments when she wanted to pick up the phone, to tell him she had forgiven him, to pretend it never happened. But deep down, she knew she couldn't erase the betrayal, no matter how hard she tried. And then, one evening, when the weight of it all became too much, Susan sat down and wrote in her journal. It was a habit she hadn't kept for years, but it was the only way she knew how to process the swirling emotions inside her. She wrote about the love they had shared, the life they had built, and the pain of seeing it all fall apart. By the time she finished, she realized something: no matter what decision she made, she couldn't let the past define her. She couldn't let it trap her in a life of regret and heartbreak. She would need to face the truth, whether it meant staying or leaving. And so, she made her decision. She would give herself one more chance to heal, but this time, she would do it on her terms. The decision wasn't easy, but Susan knew she couldn't keep living in this emotional limbo. She had spent so many years trying to keep everything intact, to preserve the life they had built, but now she had to focus on herself. She needed to regain a sense of control, to rebuild what had been shattered, not just her trust in Mark, but her own sense of identity. The following day, Susan called Mark. Her voice was calm, almost detached, but there was a strength to it that he hadn't heard in weeks. "Mark, I've made my decision," she said. "I need to be honest with you. I've tried to keep the door open, but I can't keep pretending that everything is okay. You've hurt me more than I ever thought possible. And as much as I want to believe we can fix this, I don't know if I can. I don't know if I can fix me." Mark's breath caught on the other end of the line. "Susan, please, don't say that. I'll do whatever it takes. I can't lose you. Not like this." She sighed softly, the weight of it all pressing down on her. "I don't think you understand, Mark. This isn't about what you can do for me anymore. It's about what I need. I need to find myself again. I need to stop living in the shadow of what you did." There was a long pause, and for a moment, Susan thought he might say something, anything, to convince her to stay. But instead, he just whispered, "I'm sorry. I don't know how to fix this. His words didn't sting as much as they used to. In fact, they sounded hollow now, just another attempt to fill the empty space between them. And for the first time in a long time, Susan realized that she didn't need his apologies to move on. She had to do it for herself. I need you to leave, she said, her voice steady now. I need space. I need time. Please understand that this isn't easy for me. It's the hardest thing I've ever had to do. The line fell silent for a long beat, but Mark didn't argue. He knew there was nothing more he could say. He had done too much damage, and now it was up to Susan to decide what her future would look like. I'll pack my things and go, he finally said. I won't fight you on this, Susan. I don't deserve to. It wasn't a relief, but it was something, an acknowledgement that he was no longer trying to hold on to her in a way that suffocated her. It felt like the first step toward freedom. Freedom for both of them. Susan ended the call and sat for a long moment, the phone still pressed to her ear. She felt exhausted, as if all the energy she had left was finally draining out of her. But she knew this was the right decision. She didn't know where her life would go from here, but for the first time in weeks, she felt a flicker of hope. Later that afternoon, Mark came by to pick up his things. It was awkward, painfully so. Neither of them knew how to move through this, how to navigate the space between them now that everything had changed. Mark stood in the doorway, a bag in his hand, staring at the place they had shared for so many years. I'm sorry for everything, Susan, he said quietly. I wish I could make it right. She nodded, but there was no anger in her anymore, no bitterness. Just a quiet, weary acceptance. You can't fix what's broken, Mark. But I hope you find what you're looking for. For both our sakes. He nodded slowly, his eyes filled with emotion, but he didn't argue. He left without another word, his footsteps echoing down the hallway as he walked out of her life for good. Susan stood in the doorway for a long time, watching him go. When he disappeared from sight, she felt a strange emptiness settle in, but also a sense of relief. The weight of the decision was still heavy on her shoulders, but she could finally breathe again. The next few weeks were a blur of adjustments. Susan threw herself into her own healing, doing things she hadn't done in years. She spent time with Karen, rekindling their bond over quiet dinners and late-night talks. She focused on herself, her health, her passions, the parts of her that had been buried under the weight of a marriage she had tried too hard to fix. Slowly, she found pieces of herself again. She enrolled in a painting class, something she had always wanted to do but had never made time for. The first few attempts were awkward, but the act of creating, of letting herself get lost in something other than the hurt, became her refuge. Her days were quiet, peaceful in ways they hadn't been for years. She started taking long walks, letting the fresh air fill her lungs and clear her mind. And for the first time in a long time, she allowed herself to feel something other than grief, hope, even if it was small. One afternoon, as she sat outside on her porch with a cup of tea, Susan reflected on everything that had happened. She didn't regret her decision. She knew it was the right one. Mark had betrayed her, but he hadn't taken her strength. She still had that. She still had herself. In the months that followed, Susan continued to rebuild. The road was long and often lonely, but she no longer felt as if she was carrying the weight of the past. It was a new chapter, and while she wasn't sure where it would lead, she knew that for the first time in years, she was in control of her own story. And that, she realized, was all she needed to move forward. Months had passed since Mark had left. Susan's life had settled into a rhythm she hadn't known in years. The void left by his absence was still there, but it was no longer a constant ache. It was more of a distant hum, there, but not consuming her every thought. She had learned how to live without him, how to fill the space in ways that were more about her and less about what had been. She continued her painting classes, and her confidence grew. Each brushstroke felt like a small act of reclaiming the parts of herself she had long forgotten. Her small house, once a symbol of shared memories with Mark, had transformed into a place of solace and personal expression. One day, as Susan was coming home from a walk through the neighborhood, her phone buzzed in her pocket. She didn't check it immediately, as she was still adjusting to the habit of living without constant interruptions. But when she did glance at the screen, her heart skipped. It was a message from Karen, Mark called. He wants to meet. Says he's got something important to tell you, Susan hesitated. The thought of Mark reaching out again stirred something deep within her, a flicker of uncertainty, a remnant of the woman she used to be. But she quickly squashed it. She had moved on. She didn't owe him anything. Still, curiosity gnawed at her. The message wasn't an invitation to reconcile, it was an invitation to hear him out, to understand what had changed in him, if anything. It had been so long since they'd spoken, and she was no longer sure what to expect. She decided to go. Not for him, but for herself. To close that chapter completely, to know if there was anything left to salvage from the wreckage of their past. That evening, they met at a small cafe. Mark was already there when Susan arrived, sitting at a table near the back, his eyes scanning the room nervously. He stood when she approached, his expression filled with a mixture of anticipation and regret. "Susan," he said, his voice hesitant. "Thank you for agreeing to meet." She gave a small nod but didn't sit down immediately. She wanted to maintain a sense of distance, to hold on to the control she had worked so hard to regain. "I'm here. Let's talk." Mark motioned to the chair across from him, and Susan sat, folding her arms across her chest. The silence stretched for a moment before he spoke. "I know I don't deserve this, but I had to see you. I had to apologize again. And I need to tell you something important." Susan didn't respond, her gaze fixed on him, waiting for him to continue. She was calm, almost detached, but there was a faint, steady pulse of her old self under the surface. The part of her that once believed in them, in the life they had built. Mark's eyes flickered down to his hands, which were clenched on the table. "I've been seeing a therapist," he said quietly. "I started months ago, after everything. I knew I had to do something. I didn't realize how broken I was, Susan. How much I had buried inside me. And I've spent this time trying to figure out who I am, what I need to change. It's been hard, but I know now that I can't keep running from my mistakes." Susan listened, but inside, she felt nothing. Not anger, not sadness, just a quiet numbness. It was too late for words. Too late for apologies. Mark looked up, meeting her gaze for the first time since they had sat down. "I don't expect you to forgive me. I don't even expect you to believe that I've changed. But I need you to know that I'm working on it. I'm trying to be a better man, a better person. For myself. And if you ever want to talk again, to see me as someone you might trust again, I'll be here. But only when you're ready." Susan exhaled slowly, her fingers tapping rhythmically on the table. She had prepared herself for this moment, for this speech that Mark had obviously rehearsed. She had heard it before, in one form or another, when he had apologized and begged for another chance. She had heard it in the desperate messages, the tearful calls. But it was different now. She was different. "I don't know if I'll ever trust you again, Mark," she said, her voice steady, but there was a new finality to it. "I don't know if I even want to try. But I appreciate that you're trying to make things right, for yourself. That's the first step. And maybe, that's enough." Mark's eyes shimmered with unshed tears, but Susan didn't look away. She had nothing left to give him. Not the version of herself that had loved him, had trusted him. She had given him that woman, and he had destroyed her. "Goodbye, Mark," she added softly, standing up before he could respond. There was no anger in her, no bitterness. Only a quiet resignation. He watched her walk away, his body frozen, as if unsure of what to do next. But Susan didn't look back. She had finally come full circle, from the devastation of his betrayal to a place where his presence no longer had the power to control her life. She was free. When she stepped outside into the cool evening air, a sense of peace washed over her. It wasn't a dramatic moment, but it was a significant one. She had faced him one last time, had heard his apologies, but had also acknowledged that she no longer needed him to move forward. She was finally on her own terms. The next day, Susan walked through the park near her home, the leaves crunching beneath her feet. She felt lighter, as if a weight had been lifted from her shoulders. It was time to focus on the future, on the life she had left to build. She wasn't sure what that life would look like yet, but she no longer feared the uncertainty. For the first time in a long time, she felt in control of her own destiny. And that was enough. As the weeks passed, Susan continued to rebuild, not just the pieces of her life, but herself. There was a sense of quiet joy that began to take root in her heart, an understanding that she didn't need anyone's validation to feel whole. For the first time in years, she wasn't living in the shadow of a past that had held her captive. She was free. And that freedom, more than anything, gave her the courage to fully embrace the life she was crafting for herself. The painting class had become her refuge. What once started as a way to pass the time, to fill the empty spaces, had grown into something more, a passion, an outlet. She had discovered that the act of creating wasn't just a way to escape her feelings, it was a way to express everything she had been through. Each brushstroke felt like a conversation she'd been waiting years to have with herself. One evening, as she sat in front of her easel, the soft glow of the setting sun filtering through the window, Susan found herself smiling. She had finally painted a piece she was proud of, a landscape of the lake she had visited often with Mark, but this time, it was different. It wasn't tainted by the memories of the past. It was just, hers. The calm, serene water reflected the stillness she now felt within herself. She took a step back and admired the work. A sense of accomplishment washed over her, and for the first time, she realized how much she had grown. She had come a long way from the woman who had once been so lost in betrayal, wondering if she could ever recover. Now, she saw herself clearly, strong, resilient, and capable of finding peace, no matter the circumstances. Her relationship with Karen had deepened, too. The long conversations, the shared laughter, and even the quiet moments of simply being in each other's company had helped fill the gaps in Susan's life. She no longer felt as though she were missing something. In fact, she was learning that sometimes, letting go was the key to gaining everything she had been searching for. One Saturday afternoon, Susan took a walk through the town square. It had been a while since she had ventured out to the local cafe, and she felt a sudden pull to visit it again. When she arrived, she ordered her usual, a cup of chamomile tea, and sat by the window, watching the people pass by, lost in their own worlds. The cafe had always been a place she'd shared with Mark, but today, it felt like a place just for her. As she sipped her tea, her phone buzzed. She glanced at the screen and saw a message from Karen, *, I'm so proud of you, sis. You've come so far. I'm really happy for you, *. The simple words warmed her heart. She wasn't sure if Karen knew just how much her support had meant, but it had been everything. And it wasn't just Karen, Susan had surrounded herself with people who lifted her up. People who reminded her that she was worthy of love, peace, and happiness. She spent the afternoon there, reading and watching the world go by. As the sun set, casting a soft golden glow across the street, she felt a sense of contentment she hadn't felt in years. Life, it seemed, had a way of unfolding exactly the way it was supposed to. And then, as she walked home, something unexpected happened. She saw a couple walking hand in hand, laughing as they strolled down the sidewalk. For a brief moment, Susan felt a pang of something she couldn't quite place. It wasn't jealousy, nor was it regret. It was a quiet recognition, a realization that her path didn't have to mirror anyone else's. She had carved her own. The next morning, Susan woke to the sound of birds outside her window, a soft breeze stirring the curtains. She stretched, feeling the warmth of the sunlight on her skin, and smiled. Today was just another day, a day she could choose to live fully, on her own terms. The pain of the past still lingered, but it no longer had a hold on her. She was moving forward. The phone rang, breaking her thoughts, and Susan picked it up, expecting it to be Karen. But it was a call she hadn't anticipated, a call from Mark. Her heart didn't race like it used to. There was no sense of dread or anticipation. She let the phone ring twice before answering. Hello. Susan. I just wanted to check in. See how you're doing, Mark's voice came through, tentative and unsure. She paused, weighing the decision to continue the conversation. There was no bitterness in her heart, just a sense of finality that had settled over her over time. She had moved on, and that was enough. Mark wasn't a part of her life anymore. I'm doing well, she said, her voice calm and steady. I'm in a good place. Mark was silent for a moment, and when he spoke again, his words were gentle. I'm glad to hear that. You deserve it, Susan. There was no need for anything more, no need to relive the past. Thank you, Mark. I hope you find peace, too. And with that, she ended the call. She set the phone down on the table and took a deep breath. She had faced him one last time, not out of obligation, but out of the simple need to be free from the past. And now, she was free. The final ties had been severed. In that moment, Susan realized that she had done what she had set out to do. She had healed, found her footing again, and embraced the future that lay ahead. The journey wasn't over, it never would be, but she was no longer afraid of what came next. As she looked out the window, watching the world move on outside, she smiled. The future was wide open, and for the first time, it was hers to create. And that was exactly how she wanted it.